Hi, welcome to DFW SEM tonight. Um, we've got an exciting show with John McAlpin. Going to talk about, he's the director of Cardinal Digital Marketing for SEO, and he's going to talk about entity optimization. Um, Everyone's remote, so we're all virtual. We got Julie down in Houston. She's a little out right now because weather's taken out her summer connection. Um, we have Jenna Williams, our secretary, treasurer Bart Peters, uh, Jordan Pearson, VP of sponsorship, um, Casey Watkins, VP of communications, Tim Shane. He's at large on the board, and Chris O'Connor, awesome for running State of Search. Man, that's coming up. Excited about that. Um, and without further ado, I'll let John have the floor, and we'll save the save questions for the end.
Hey, DFW SEM, thanks for having me back. I am here to talk today about the knowledge graph, knowledge panels, and entities as a whole. Something that I'm seeing a lot is a lot of different fluctuations happening in the knowledge graph and different things happening in knowledge panels, and Google's always testing things. So we're talking about how to take control of your brand's identity through entity optimization. Quick little bit about me. Actually a Texas native. Grew up in Texas and just recently moved to Colorado. I am the SEO strategy director at Cardinal Digital Marketing, and I'm an independent consultant. I typically specialize in large scale healthcare SEO, but I also consult on technical SEO, site speed, entity semantic SEO, and content strategy. I'm a frequent contributor at Search Engine Land, Search Engine Journal. I've been in on-crawl and various industry podcasts. You can contact me through my website, but the best way to reach me is on Twitter at SEO Counseling. I've worked with some of the largest brands in health and healthcare, consulting at a very high level and all the way down to doing the nitty-gritty things that make SEO go. But enough about me. Let's talk about you and your brand. What we're going to discuss here is 4 sections. One is, what is the knowledge graph and how does it work? Then we're going to dive into research techniques to explore the knowledge graph and how to figure out how to get into it. Section 3, we'll talk about some specific steps that literally anyone can do to build your brand's knowledge panel. And step 4 is how to track it over time. Now, let's dive right in. So what is the knowledge graph? A knowledge graph is actually a organized machine system that Google uses. And I mean, you'll hear knowledge graph in a lot of different tech terms, but we're going to refer to Google's knowledge graph specifically. And what it is it's a stored data set comprised of entities. Now, an entity can be a noun, it can be a person, place, or thing. It can be a concept, an event, a historical event. It can be really anything that you can define. But to keep things simple, let's talk about nouns right here. So these are all entities. You have living things, which breaks down into subcategories of you have plants and animals, breaks down even further into subcategories. And sometimes you'll have relationships between them, like cows and herbs, and they eat them. So the whole point here is that each thing is its own entity, and there's always going to be some kind of relationship between them. And these relationships are critical to what we call semantic SEO in building your brand's knowledge panel. Now, each one is assigned a numeric ID, and it'll look something like this. So you'll see that they start with either a /G or a /M. If it's a /M, that means it's been an entity for a long time. And Google, essentially, when they started building their knowledge graph, they acquired a company called Freebase and merged all of that data into their own knowledge graph and rebranded it to be called Wikidata. So you can actually go to like wikidata.com and look at get a kind of a sneak peek at Google's knowledge graph. If it starts with a G, a /G, that means it's a newer one that Google discovered on its own without acquiring the data. So that's just a quick little semantic thing there. But these numeric IDs essentially are important because it helps Google, instead of using machine learning to process the search query and all this, it uses these IDs to associate to a concept. And in machine learning terms, it's technically faster to retrieve that ID and understand that concept versus trying to understand text as a whole. And so where that really comes into play is 15% of Google searches every day are searches that Google has never seen before. And so when Google gets these searches that they've never seen before, essentially they have to understand, and they're usually long tail. They're not like these short tail, like 1, 2, 3 word queries. They're these very long tail queries. So Google has a lot to understand about concepts and things like that. So they use entities in this case to help provide the most relevant searches possible. And assigning these numeric IDs to entities helps to, and the key word here is disambiguate the concepts. And disambiguation is the whole point of entities. So let's talk about this specifically. If I were to search just the word Woodstock, that could relate to so many different things. There are tons of cities named Woodstock. There's documentaries about Woodstock, about different things about Woodstock. There's the original music festival in '69 when they brought it back in '99 or '94. And then there's a new documentary coming out, or it just came out when they did it again in '99. And there's like so many different things that it could be about. And so when Google comes here, they use relevance to understand which entity you're talking about. And when there is no relevance, they will use what's called a relevancy score. So all these entities actually have a relevancy score. And I'll show you what that looks like here in a little bit. And so when it just has this, it uses that relevancy score to say, okay, well, based on how relevant it is in modern trends, we think that they're talking about this new documentary that just came out. Or if you have no real search history with Google, they might just bring up the city or the music festival. There's the age-old "it depends," but this relevancy score helps Google deliver the best result. So here's some more examples of ways that Google can disambiguate. We talk about living things. Google really most closely associates that with the entity organisms. And based on organisms' relevancy score, that's most likely what's going to come up. And what also could come up with a high relevancy score is this living things song. It's a kid song by someone named Jack Hartman. Plants, plants as an entity as a whole, just very broad, but it could also show up as plants versus zombies. That has a very high relevancy score in Google. And depending on sometimes your search history or your context of the search, you might get that result as opposed to just plants. Same thing with herbs, same thing with animals. It could be, the actual creature animals, or it could be the animals, the band, and dogs. It really depends. But these entity IDs help them associate most closely with a topic. But let's talk about your brand. When we're doing brand research and entity research and figuring out how to build a knowledge panel, there's a couple of research techniques you'll want to do. And what you'll want to do basically is find out where Google is getting this information from. So you can do this if your brand already has a knowledge panel, but if you don't, apply these tactics to your competitors that do have a knowledge panel. So let's talk about first, where does Google gather its data? So when we look at their documentation, it says that essentially they get it from public sources, which is just basically the web. They can get it from licensed sources. So a good example of a licensed source would be like stock information, or they'll license it from sport leagues. If you're looking at a score or latest or whatever your team's schedule is, they can license that information from those sports leagues. They can license information from Ticketmaster and StubHub for latest concerts. So there's a lot of license data there in the knowledge panel. And then also they can get it directly from your website. Now I will caveat, they mostly get directly from your own website when you already are an established entity. I've almost never seen a knowledge panel created just from having content on your website. It's usually third-party data that brings this together. So let's talk about where Google really gathers their data, because they may say one thing, but our data shows where it's really coming from. And one is Wikipedia, where they license data from Wikipedia. This source from Calicube shows that, and this is tracking just 217 domains, and it's showing that over 67% is coming from Wikipedia. I've seen other sources state that 99% of all new knowledge graphs come from Wikipedia. And that's what they say. If you want a knowledge graph, you have to get a Wikipedia, which is not necessarily true. Another big chunk comes from their Freebase acquisition, And so you'll see here on this chart, it says none in the second row. That is just unknown where things come from. And I'll show you some examples of where unknown data can come from. License data, we just talked about that. And the fourth one here is trusted RDFs, which is an acronym for Resource Description Frameworks. And one of my favorite examples of an RDF would be Google Business Profiles or Google My Business. And the reason why Google pulls from these is because these are usually really consistently structured. They know where to find the address information, the phone number, the website, all of that. Other RDFs can be any really directory that you put your business information in. It could be Crunchbase. It could be, another good example would be IMDb. If you're looking for movie information or actor information, IMDb is a great one. It's a good example of an RDF. So another thing here is when you're looking at a knowledge panel, it's good to know that Google's knowledge panels mix data sources together. It's rarely going to be all from one source when they're really robust. So here's a client of mine where I noticed that they have a Wikipedia page. So Wikipedia always provides the most robust knowledge panels. And so you'll see they have a really great description here and a link to that Wikipedia page. Just below that, their Google Business Profile is feeding in information like their address, their hours of the office hours, the products, and the phone. Then they pull directly from the website to find where they're accredited. And then it goes back to Wikipedia to show the number of students, the founding date, and the dean. And then at the very bottom, we even see, I'm sure you guys have seen this before, but reviews from different sites. And you can get reviews from all kinds of sites. And if you're like a SaaS product, you can get reviews from specific SaaS review sites. But then we have this little mystery down here. It says school type is a medical school. And when you click on that link, it goes to a Google page that explains where they get, explains knowledge panels and where they get information from, but it doesn't say where they found this information. Now, Wikipedia and the website itself say, oh, yeah, this is like a medical school. And of course, the GMB says it's a university. But nothing does it say specifically medical school. And it doesn't tell you exactly where they get this information. When we go back to that chart, it shows where Google's getting this information from. That would be categorized under none. Because that's the mystery there. It's great that they've discovered that and categorized them as such. That's what we want. But that is still the unknown information right there. So after you kind of gathered and figured out where your brands or where your competitors or where your current brand's knowledge panels information is coming from, you can actually search in Google's knowledge graph itself directly for free. If you search in Google Knowledge Graph Search API, this will pop up. It'll show this page, and then if you just wait a second, this pop-up will show. And down here, you'll see query. So I've typed in DFW SEM, and it has this long scroll in JSON format of all the different information that it has about DFW SEM. Now, if this structure is not like super clear and you want a better user experience to look at this information, you can go, Merkle has technicalseo.com. They have a knowledge graph search that might be a little bit more easy to digest. And what we can see here is pretty cool. So the very top result, and it's sorted by the far second to the right column, see relevancy score. And so at the very top, we see DFW SEM is an organization, it's nonprofit, and here is their ID. It has their URL and a relevancy score of 16, followed by events. Now remember, an entity can be anything, and events is our big one. And you can see the relevancy score of 1 because June was fairly recent, but all these older ones now have a relevancy score of 0 because they are no longer relevant. Another tool you can use is CaliCube, has a free search and even have a reverse search as well. So if you don't want to search by brand, but you want to search by an actual ID, you can do that. There's a lot of options out there. And now if you want to look at semantic SEO as a whole concept beyond your brand, and just look at your industry, you can go to InLinks, and they have a free trends tool where you can dive into specific industries. So if you want to look into marketing, you can look into subtopics within marketing and see which topics are trending. So if you think that there's a lot going on in the knowledge graph, a lot of changes and how featured snippets are being displayed and things like that, you can go into here and see how things are trending. So let's talk about specific steps on how to build your brand's knowledge panel. Now, before we get in, let's talk about a couple caveats. Let's do some myth busting here. So some true things are nothing is guaranteed. And it can take over a year to see, or several years to see results. It took several years to see my own knowledge panel, and I wasn't even trying that hard, but it can happen sooner. It can happen, may never happen, but it will take time. Even when you try to submit changes in an already existing one, it can take weeks for things to show up. Another thing is your knowledge panel may have different iterations. You'll see, one version and you'll see it pulling from different sources and it'll change over time. And the third thing is consistency will be critical. That's going to be my keyword moving forward. At the beginning, we talked about disambiguation. Now we're going to talk about consistency. Now, here are some myths that we need to dispel. You do not have to have a Wikipedia page to get into the knowledge panel. You can do it without one. I did it without one, and anyone can do it without one. Another myth is once you claim your knowledge panel, you can easily add to it. Now, once you claim your knowledge panel, you can edit information, but all of that gets reviewed. Nothing's instant, and it takes time, and you have to have sources on why, and it shows why it needs to be changed. But you cannot add to it just by claiming it. To add to it, you have to find different sources that may feed into it and then be consistent with that information as well. And then again, that's not even guaranteed that it'll happen, but it is possible. As you saw with the original one, I can guarantee you that knowledge panel did not start out that robust. It happened over time. And then the other one is just because you're a large brand, you deserve a knowledge panel. It doesn't matter who you are. You could be Nike. It doesn't mean you deserve a knowledge panel. Because we have to remember that this is an algorithmic machine, and we have to feed it that information in order for it to actually process and give you that knowledge panel. Now, I'm not saying you probably don't deserve it. You just got to, give it the signals it needs in order to earn one. So let's talk about what those signals are. Step one is to create your entity home. Now, this seems pretty simple, but you need a website somewhere to feed all that entity information. Now, that may seem simple, but sometimes we'll come across these larger brands that have tons of subdomains and tons of subsidiaries. You need to focus on one entity at a time. And that will be your main source of truth. On that source of truth, you need to have clear about content. And as you can see here, at the very top, I have a short 1-2 sentence of who I am and a bullet list of what I do. And then I have a paragraph of my about. I also have an about page with more robust content, but this is where we're talking about consistency. I use this exact same about content on every profile I use. So no matter where Google discovers me, they're going to see that same consistent information, building trust about who I am. And then we're going to talk about creating extensive schema markup, because schema markup is going to help Google better understand who you are and across the web. Next is you're going to want to create some public profiles. Directories are well-structured RDS. I really recommend niche directories for your industry. And what's cool is a lot of these directories also use schema markup to help bolster that as well. And if they're in your industry, Google will better understand who you are. Now, Crunchbase is a big one if you're an individual or a company. I've seen lots of knowledge panels being created through Crunchbase for organizations and brands. And my first knowledge panel was fed through Crunchbase. And so it's a really common RDF, and that's a great one to start out with. But create more than one. Get your name out there. Get your brand's footprint out there. And once you have a couple of these really relevant ones, in your schema markup, use same as. Now, Google doesn't use same as anymore for your social media, but they do use it for semantic purposes. So I put same as my my website, as my profiles on Search Engine Land, Search Engine Journal, my LinkedIn, OnCrawl, and Crunchbase, all these places. And what I did is I know that Google pulls knowledge graph information from all of these sources specifically. And that's why I chose to list these as same as, because I've seen these on my competitors. I've seen these sources be used as source data in a knowledge panel. And that's why I chose those. So find out your competitors, where their data is coming from, get on those same profiles, those same websites, and put your same as markup here as well. Next is contribute to your industry. find industry publications, and that could be whether you're writing, it could be speaking at events, it could be writing a book. Contribute to your industry and create these author profiles, because that is a great way for Google to recognize who you are, because a lot of these sites have really high authority, and that will garner a lot more trust. Next is to be consistent with your linking. So on all of my profiles, I'm making sure to link back to my entity home. That's another way we can be consistent, and another way for Google to show your website in the knowledge panel. And then number 6 is to repeat the previous steps. You really got to keep going over and over again and be consistent with this, because you may get a few months in and be like, hey, it's not working, I'm not getting anywhere. It just takes time, and consistency is key. Again, it took me several years to get in just by contributing. And that wasn't even my intention from the get-go. I just wanted to contribute. And then I realized the impact of it, started doing some of those other steps, and kept contributing, and eventually it happens. And so when it finally does happen and you get that knowledge panel, as I mentioned, there's going to be some iterations. So my first iteration that I saw was all from Crunchbase. And which was cool is Crunchbase provided a really rich knowledge panel, very well structured to a fault. And what I mean by to a fault here is if you can see that where it says LinkedIn, it even says view on LinkedIn. It doesn't even show the link or the profile or anything. And that's because that's the anchor text that's used on Crunchbase. So when you click on that link, it just goes to the Crunchbase profile, not actual LinkedIn. And I even tried to submit that as like an error, and it never got fixed because nothing's guaranteed with this. A second iteration is it kept this Crunchbase information up here, but then down here at the bottom, you can see that they're pulling the description now from Search Engine Journal. And then they switched my image with an old caricature that I use on OnCrawl. And then the third iteration, they switched it to Search Engine Land image, and they kept the Search Engine Journal description and then the Crunchbase information below. So as you can see, it starts with one source of information, and it starts to mix in some of the other sources that I use, and now it's a whole bunch of information. And funny enough, it's actually gone back right now. When I looked before today, it was back to Crunchbase over here. So it mixes up quite a bit. And you may have some stakeholders that say, hey, things are changing all the time. What can we do? How do we know when it's going to change? And we really have no control over when it's going to change. Google's still trying to, for me, this is still fairly new. It's been several months, but it's going to take Google some time to understand like consistency, what information they're going to want to use is most valuable. But there are two tools that you can use to track knowledge panel changes. My favorite one right now is Visual Ping. You can literally just copy the URL or give it specific instructions on how to search. And then you can highlight the area that you want it to track, and it can track that over time. And you can do this for free as well. A paid tool you can use is CaliQ Pro. That's only for agencies though. So if you're looking at just internal as a brand, they may not accept you. They're only accepting agencies at this time. But Visual Ping might be a good way to start. And that will give you can do daily monitoring, send you emails. Now, tracking algorithmic changes, you can use any of the main SEO tracking tools like SEMrush and things like that can track algorithmic changes in knowledge panels. But that's essentially how you get yourself into the knowledge graph and build your brand's knowledge panel. If you have, we're going to open it up here to the floor for some questions. But if you have any follow-up questions later on, you can follow me on Twitter and ask. I'm most responsive there at SEO Counseling. You can add me on LinkedIn. And if you want to work with me, I do consulting on hourly rates. You can find me at my website, or my email is just me@johnmcalpin.com. Or if you're looking for full agency support, you can visit cardinaldigitalmarketing.com. And that's it.
Any questions coming in?
Hey, John, what was the... you said Google had the Knowledge Graph API.
Yes.
And what was the second one?
Technicalseo.com. That's a tool from the agency Merkle. that tool is actually a favorite amongst the industry because it has so many different tools and they have a very easy UI. But technicalseo.com should be a bookmark for anyone dabbling in SEO.
Okay.
So I know that some people are just digesting things, so extra questions will filter in. But I'm really curious. I know you had to have done some studies, like one site suddenly takes over the knowledge graph, like and dominates that. Do you at the time were you able to like look back and go, maybe there was some like domain authority changes or maybe different activity
I
from
think
like
it has to do with activity because the relevancy score has a lot to do with activity. A good example of that is the founder of DFW SEM, Bill Hartzer. He had some really interesting stuff happen to his knowledge panel around state of search, and he was presenting at one time, and it pulled from his like presenter profile on the website as the source. And I thought that was really interesting to see because like it went from his own website and his own information to just that page, and then it switched back later. And then every time I publish an article, I notice that like for a while that becomes the dominant source. So I think it changes definitely with activity. Thanks, Chris. Great to see some familiar faces in the audience as well.
Yeah, I think Bill Hartzer is connected into the algorithm directly, but that's
Yeah.
just I can't prove or disprove.
Yeah, I ironically moved to like the same area that he did, forgetting he was over here. And so we may have to start like a DFW SEM here in Colorado or something, like a Italy branch.
Got a group of former DFW SEMers and other marketers that have been going to Colorado. We got to have a great group there.
I know it's getting big. I gotta tell you that weather so much better. Our high was 88, 85 today. I know.
God. I'd take 85.
Oh, Amal's joking. I used to work for Amal here in the audience. She thinks my knowledge graph happened because of SEO dogs. And I worked with her. Very well could have. Any other questions about entity optimization or anything like that?
Yeah, so disambiguation, is that like, I guess just the word sounds like it's like, removing the ambiguity, right? Like,
Yeah.
let's get it specific. Is it kind of like we could say kryptonite in regular conversation just to like, hey, that's my kryptonite, right? But are you like, I guess, is this kind of like, if I've got this right, all right, if I just say kryptonite, it might not mean much on a page, but if I were to say Superman and Lois Lane and Lex Luthor, now I'm kind of really honing in. And even if I didn't say the word kryptonite, AI could kind of, or if I didn't say the word Superman, the AI could kind of like, hey, I think this is about Superman. Is that the concept?
Yeah. So if you just type in the word kryptonite, I mean, that can be, again, like so many things. It could be that Three Doors Down song, but based on relevancy in the time. So, like, let's say TikTok decides to use that as a sound, and now it's a trending song because we've noticed that social influences can bring trends back into Google. And so song could come up. If you just type in kryptonite, it may associate it with this. We call it the Urban Dictionary slang term of like my weakness. But then, yeah, like you said, if you start using some of those other comic characters, it might bring in Superman as like the core entity relationship.
Oh, right on. That's
Okay. So my question is, you said you use the same information across every site you post on.
Mm-hmm.
What
As
happens if? Go ahead. I was just going to say, what happens if something super cool happens to you and now you want to update it?
So that's a great question because that actually happened when I moved because it kept saying I lived in Dallas. And so what I did is I ended up going to every single site and updating it to Colorado Springs. And then obviously the knowledge graph didn't pick it up right away. So then I would go in and because I claimed my knowledge panel, I was able to adjust and edit and then drop several links as proof. So I said, hey, this entity no longer lives in Dallas, it lives in Colorado Springs. Here are source information, and just put like a bunch of links. And then about 2 weeks later, it updated.
Okay.
Yeah. Even then, like it takes time because I'm pretty sure they're manually reviewed, but I'm not positive there.
So if there's a place like I'll say on my Facebook profile, if I were wanting to do this, and I change locations, would it be kind of like a rel canonical to go concept to go back and put in the places that I've lived before, so that if there's other profiles, it's matching up and go, okay, that's the same person. We can see that. I mean,
That depends if Google finds it relevant. They may not find previous locations relevant for a person. They may find that relevant for like a sports team, for example. Like if a sports team, if they say, like, okay, like, the Seattle Supersonics became the Oklahoma City Thunder. And they're like, okay, so, and someone searches, where did the OKC Thunder used to be? And in their knowledge graph, they'll say, oh, well, based on this history entity that we have of this event, we know they used to be in Seattle and be the Seattle Supersonics. And it'll pull that as like a featured snippet.
Oh, right on.
So it depends on whether that entity is recorded and whether Google finds that relevant to anything, really.
So some things may be just too trivial to worry about.
Yeah, and like so, I've someone even challenged me on Twitter to search, okay, where does John McAlpin work? Where does John McAlpin live? And like it shows like featured snippets pulling from the knowledge panel, and so it's kind of interesting how they use that. And because actually entities are really important because that's where Google gets most of their knowledge, their featured snippet information is from the knowledge graph.
So we've got a question. Bart Peters is asking, did gaining the entity affect your personal website's ranking, as it seems that LinkedIn and Facebook are above your personal site?
So yes and no. Not I would say no. I get more traffic just from publishing online, but honestly, all these other sources that I was listed in were ranking higher. I'm just now starting to move up the ranks of my personal site for my personal brand, but it didn't really help. And I think that's more because my website is just like a personal like portfolio site. It's nothing I put like a ton of effort into. And these other sites have such high domain authority and usually high relevancy when you're searching for a person. It's like looking for a restaurant. You're almost always going to see Yelp in the top 3. So when you look for a person, especially in the professional sense, you're usually going to see like LinkedIn, sometimes Crunchbase, really high up.
Does that answer your question, Bart? I personally do paid, so I have to listen to every. I get all of the. Here's exactly how everything works. This is what you do. You pay this much on SEO. It's like it's all indirect. So I try not to pick this up and.
Yeah, SEO is really weird because it's like you can't just turn a knob and like all of a sudden like you can expect this kind of CPA or something like that. It's very much like I hope I'm sending all of the right signals to make something happen. And as long as you're consistent, you usually see like the right results. And it's weird because you have to be really consistent to see the right results. And you have to have experience to know, am I being consistent in the right thing or am I wasting my time in the wrong area? And that just comes with experience. And honestly, it's kind of like the old woodworking saying, measure twice, cut once. Do a ton of research to make sure you're doing the right signals and putting your efforts in the right places. And that's why I think it's really important with entities to like really look at where your competitors are getting their knowledge graph information from to make sure you're doing that plus more. And that's the general rule of thumb with SEO or really any kind of business practice. Do what your competitors are doing plus more.
Makes a lot of sense. So I guess follow the 80-20 rule, and you're like, you hone in, find the like these are the ones that matter the most. Spend 80% most of your time on those, and then I guess wide versus deep, and then spend a little bit of time finding extra directories and stuff that to send signals.
Yep, and exactly. Because I focus my primary entity focusing on like I'll publish sometimes on my website, but like that's my home. But as far as other sources, I focus mostly on LinkedIn, in search engine land at the moment. It was search engine journal for a while, but now I'm mostly focusing on search engine land. And so that way, every time new articles come up, Google sees my profile and my link going back to my website. And if they do happen to get to my company website, I made sure to link back to my personal site on my profile there. So I'm just trying to, if we go back to that web of interconnected entities, making sure that there's always a link back to the home at some point. And then in some cases in my profiles, I can link both to my agency site and my personal site. So there's always some kind of connected relevance, because my goal obviously is to just have the most robust knowledge panel that it can be, because this is really just a big test to me to see what kind of different websites and tactics are influencing it. A lot of what I showed are things that are not new, things that people have already been doing. But the only way we can learn more is through constant testing.
What is it? So let's say you got your knowledge panel up, and you spent the time. What is the benefit that you're really getting out of it?
Okay, so it is completely different for me to a brand. So me personally, that's kind of like what would we call it? Like a portfolio trophy, really. If I were to, for some reason, want to get another job somewhere, I can say, look, I write at these places and I have my own knowledge panel. I'm clearly a figure in the industry. It kind of is like a ego boost, or it shows some kind of credibility to what I do. But honestly, it doesn't mean much. What's really important is for brands, because when a brand has a knowledge panel and is well established there and has that rich information, not only is that helpful for users, but it does have that sense of establishment and trust with users as well as Google. So I try to look at that more through the branded lens.
Do we have more questions? I know I personally, in my experience, was the parts are, how do you say it? They're greater than the sum of their parts, right? So having for paid, having your organic listing, if you can have a maps listing, having a knowledge panel, if you can wind up, everything, you wind up getting more out of that than just if you were individually. So personally, my experience is if I can get that there, I know that my paid results are so heavily dependent on the organic presence. So if you can get it, heck yeah.
That's a great way to look at it too. You really got to be holistic and think less as your siloed SEO or PPC. You really want to think as a complete marketer and have that complete footprint. I think it was really interesting too, because that client, the medical school that had a really robust one, looking at different competitors. Some competitors have just as robust knowledge panels, and some have hardly anything, and they haven't really focused on it. So the Google picks a random image, and your brand looks kind of weak. And I'll give you a really clear example of how branding is important here. On that medical school, all of a sudden, Google decided their main image was going to be a picture of a AC unit behind one of their crappiest dorms, the least updated dorm. And they found the back of the picture, behind it, just an AC unit. And Google says, this is your profile picture. And we were the school picked up on that, and they were pissed. What happened? And we did some digging and some research, and we found that image was coming from a user-submitted photo on their Google My Business. And we tried to just replace it with the brand photo. And this was back when Google My Business had actual support. And what we were told is it can't be just a logo. The picture has to be an actual image for Google My Business. And we knew that's where it was pulling from. So we did some kind of trickery, and we got a really great image from their island, because they're in a tropical area. And we just superimposed the logo right front and center. So if you search Trinity School of Medicine, that's what you're seeing, and that was accepted, and that's how we improved their knowledge panel. And that's really important too, because when you're searching, they were Caribbean medical school. So if you search Caribbean medical schools, you'll get a carousel at the top of all of the schools, and all of that is pulling from their knowledge panel. And so when you're looking at, if you're a prospective medical student and you search that, Are you going to pick the ones that have a really good picture, or the one that has like the AC unit behind a door?
I'd rather not have the knowledge panel. Just take that
Right.
down.
Right. So another reason why tracking is really important as well. You want to see when Google makes a whoops and makes a mistake, because Google makes mistakes all the time. It's a machine, right?
And that's you got to watch your back on that.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. But it also shows that, like, even when Google has rules, you have to be creative sometimes to figure out how to get around them.
If you were to go back through it, I guess if you were to go back through like trying to get that, what would be your shortcut? Like where you'd save yourself some time? What was it
So I've tried to do shortcuts before. Like, I had a client that really wanted a knowledge panel. All they did was hire us to get a knowledge panel, and we're like, it's gonna take time. They're like, yeah, we don't want to do that. We want to get it fast. So they said, I was like, well, you could try to get a Wikipedia page. Like, if you all of a sudden were to get a Wikipedia page, you'll get into the knowledge graph faster with a Wikipedia page than everything else I talked about. But it is super difficult. So what we did is we hired a specific Wikipedia writer. And you can't just get any writer, because getting them in Wikipedia, get an entry, they follow these very specific guidelines. You have to be totally objective. You can't have any inflection. You need to have very specific types of sources. And so we went back and forth, like, hey, here's all their PR and their press. He goes, nope, this doesn't work. This doesn't work. You need a different kind of link. You need actual third-party press. It can't be a PR. It can't do all this other stuff. And we built this Wikipedia page, never got approved months in, because there's no actual queue. They just kind of approve things at random or at relevance. So even though we like submitted it like in 1 month, just other people that could have submitted months later could have come in and got one earlier. It's kind of up to their discretion on when they approve things, if they approve things. They don't give much information. So that's a good example of that may be a shortcut, but you shouldn't put all of your eggs in that one basket, because it's not guaranteed. And that's a good example of wasted effort.
More power to you SEOs. I'm sorry, I just don't have that patience. That's a lot of work to get through.
I mean, that's also like a tertiary thing, right? I mean, you could be putting a ton of effort into your knowledge panel, but like you should have a mix of effort. It's like in PPC too, right? You wouldn't put all of your money into one single ad group. You want to have a diverse set.
Right. Got to go different directions and test it out. And
yeah. And sometimes you can hit two birds with one stone in SEO. Like, you could be doing, like guest posts and authorship in the industry, which could eventually earn you a knowledge panel, but in the meantime is also earning you backlinks and getting your name out there and getting some referral traffic. And sometimes, there's some, combo plays there. Tim, Shane, I saw you ask, is it a machine? Yes, Google is very much vindictive like Hal. So yeah, it is a machine.
Yeah, nice reference there.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Dave, I can't do that.
That's how I feel on a lot of SEO things.
So if I guess if we don't have any further questions, actually I do have. Are there business types or areas that you found are more difficult? Like if it's a generic name for a business, let's say Colorado lending, not very specific. There could be a lot of different. Colorado mortgage could be a similar name, right? Colorado home loans. I don't know if there's areas that are like that's just going to be a tough nut to crack.
That's a good question. So, because I specifically specialize in healthcare, doesn't mean I haven't done so many other industries. And like industries I've worked in heavily, healthcare, law, SaaS, things like that. All these industries have these really big powerhouse directories and publications and things like that like really earn your spot in the knowledge graph. And I'm having a hard time thinking of one that doesn't have one. I'm sure we could if we just kind of talk about it all night long, but there's usually something that's like the dominant like source of information for an industry.
Right on. I get rid of that one. Yeah, fantastic. That was. Thank you so much, John. I appreciate it. And again, this is DFW SEM with John McAlpin. Everyone have a great night. Stay